Snow doesn't just fall in Michigan's Upper Peninsula. It buries. It settles into the pine needles and the tire ruts and the silence between heartbeats until the whole world looks like nothing ever happened here. Like nothing could ever go wrong in a place this clean, this white, this still. Beneath that clean white surface, a Navy SEAL lay bound in the frozen earth, wrists zip-tied behind his back, mouth sealed with a wide strip of black tape that tasted like motor oil and betrayal. His tactical jacket was shredded at the shoulders, soaked through, stiff with cold. His face was a map of what had been done to him, a gash above his left brow, dried rust brown against pale skin, ice crystals forming in his stubble. He couldn't scream, he couldn't call out. All he could do, all he had left, was tap, two knuckles against the frozen ground above his head. Tap, 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 the rhythm of a man refusing to let his own heartbeat be the last sound he ever made. No one was coming for him. The men who put him there had made sure of that. Except they hadn't counted on Pete. And they hadn't counted on the little girl in the red parka who always followed wherever Pete led. Where are you watching from? Before we see what happens next, rate the tension of that opening from 1 to 10 in the comments. Let's see how you're feeling. The snow came down in long, slow curtains that morning, the kind that didn't rush. Up here in the Upper Peninsula, winter didn't perform. It simply arrived and stayed, indifferent and enormous, swallowing sound and color until the whole forest felt like the inside of a held breath. Nora didn't mind the quiet. She was 7 years old, and she had learned, the way children learn things no child should have to, that quiet was often safer than noise. She was small for her age, with wide brown eyes that watched everything twice before she trusted it, and dark hair tucked beneath a bright red wool hat that matched the oversized parka her grandmother had bought 2 sizes too big so she'd grow into it. She hadn't yet. The sleeves still swallowed her hands unless she rolled them, and the hem nearly reached her knees. But she loved the coat the way a child loves something that feels like armor. It was the reddest thing in any direction for miles. In a forest this gray, this white, this colorless, Nora in her red parka was a cardinal in a snowstorm. She wasn't supposed to be out this far. The rule was, stay within sight of the chimney smoke. That was the boundary her grandmother had drawn, not a fence, not a lock, just a thin gray thread rising from the cabin's stone chimney that meant home is still there, you haven't gone too far. Nora could see it if she craned her neck between the pines, barely, which she decided counted. She was collecting firewood. That was the official reason. The small canvas sack on her back held 4 pieces of split birch from the woodpile, and she'd promised Graham she was just going to the edge of the tree line and back. It was a reasonable promise. She'd meant it when she made it. But that was before Pete had other ideas. Pete was a 4-year-old German shepherd with a sable coat the color of storm clouds and amber, ears that stood upright like 2 permanent questions, and a deep, barrel chest that made him look, at rest, like a small bear wearing a dog's face. He had belonged to Nora's father before her father stopped coming home. Now he belonged to Nora, or more accurately, Nora belonged to Pete, because that was how it had always worked between them. He slept at the foot of her bed. He walked her to the school bus and waited at the corner until she disappeared around the bend. He knew her moods before she did, could tell a bad dream from a good one just by the rhythm of her breathing. Right now, Pete was not walking beside her. He was 10 feet ahead, then 15, nose dropped to the snow's surface in that locked, purposeful way that meant he had found a thread, a scent, a signal, something invisible to Nora that was louder than anything else in the world to him. His tail was up. His shoulders rolled forward with each step, deliberate, low, the way he moved when he wasn't playing. Pete, Nora called, keeping her voice to a loud whisper the way Graham had taught her. You don't shout in the deep woods. Sound carries, and you don't always know who's listening. Pete glanced back once, his amber eyes briefly acknowledging her, and kept moving. Nora followed. She always followed, because Pete had never once led her anywhere bad. The trees thinned slightly here at the edge of an old logging trail, the snow undisturbed and blue-white in the flat winter light. No tracks, no deer prints, no fox trails, none of the usual signatures the forest left on itself. Just smooth, unbroken surface stretching between the dark trunks of the pines like a blank page. It was beautiful and empty and should have felt peaceful. It didn't. Nora felt the wrongness the way she sometimes felt, whether changing, not with her eyes, but somewhere behind her sternum, a low, slow pressure building. She stopped walking and stood still. The pines held their snow in silence. Nothing moved. Even the wind had stopped, as if the forest was listening for something. Then Pete froze. Not the alert freeze of a dog who has spotted a squirrel. This was different, total, locked, every muscle in his body going rigid at once. His ears were forward and locked. His nose hovered an inch above a patch of snow that looked, to Nora's eyes, identical to every other patch around them, smooth, unbroken, unmarked. He took one step toward it, then another. Then he began to dig. Not the playful, spray-everything digging Pete did in the yard in summer. This was urgent and precise, and almost frantic, front paws tearing through the top layer of powder with a single-minded ferocity that made Nora's breath catch. Snow flew backward between his legs in arcing white fans. He wasn't stopping. He wasn't sniffing and moving on. He was committed. Pete, Nora started. And then she heard it. A sound so faint she almost reasoned it away. A dull, rhythmic knock from beneath the snow, like someone rapping their knuckles against the underside of a table. Tap, tap, tap. Nora's mind went very still. She took 3 careful steps forward and crouched beside Pete, her small knees sinking into the powder, and pressed her ear toward the ground the way she'd once pressed her ear against her grandmother's bedroom door to make sure she was still breathing in the night. Tap, tap. Not a branch, not settling ice, not the forest doing what forests do. Someone was down there. Oh no, Nora whispered, just those 2 words, soft as snow. Her small hands were already moving, already pulling at the powder alongside Pete's digging paws, scooping in quick, desperate arcs. Her knit gloves were useless against the cold and the compaction, but she didn't stop, couldn't stop, because something in her chest had flipped open like a door blown off its hinges, and the only thing on the other side was keep going, keep going, keep going. Pete's paw struck something solid. He froze immediately and shifted to careful and gentle, the same instinctive care he showed when he walked around Nora's grandmother on her bad knee days. Nora leaned in and scraped with her fingers, and dark fabric emerged from the white, rough canvas, stiff with cold, a shade of muted green that was not a color the forest wore. She scraped faster. A shoulder, a collar, a jaw covered in several days of stubble coated in frost. A face. He was a man, maybe 30, maybe older. It was hard to tell through the cold and the injuries. His dark hair was crusted with ice at the roots. There was a wound above his eyebrow, old enough to have darkened to brown at the edges, but new enough that it had bled freely before the cold sealed it. His lips were almost blue. His lashes, long and black and unfair on a face this battered, Nora thought strangely, were white with frost. Across his mouth, sealed so tightly it had reddened the skin at the edges, a wide strip of black tape. He wasn't moving, his eyes were closed. Nora's chest turned to ice. Then Pete pressed his warm nose firmly to the man's cheek. The man's lashes moved, just barely, like something beneath the surface of frozen water stirring. "Hey," Nora said, her voice shaking, and she didn't care. "Hey, wake up, wake up." She reached for the edge of the tape, her small fingers finding the corner, peeling it back the way you peel a bandage, slow at first, then quick, because slow was its own kind of cruelty. The skin beneath was raw, angry, the shape of suffering made visible. The man pulled in air the way a drowning person surfaces, chest lurching, a wet, rattling intake that turned into a cough, weak and broken, and then his eyes opened. Dark eyes, dazed, rolling first toward the gray sky, then toward the trees, then finally to the small face hovering above him. A 7-year-old girl in a red parka, cheeks flushed with cold and effort, eyes enormous and unblinking. And a German shepherd with his chin rested gently on the man's shoulder, warm breath rising in small clouds against the frozen air. Something moved through the man's face. Not relief, relief was too clean a word for it. It was something rawer, something that looked like a person realizing, against all evidence, that the world had not entirely finished with them yet. His lips moved, cracked and trembling. "Help," he rasped. The word came out in pieces, barely air. Nora looked at him, at the shredded tactical jacket, the zip ties biting into his wrists below the snow line, the patch barely visible on his shoulder that she couldn't read yet, but would later, her grandmother reading it aloud in a voice that dropped to almost nothing. Navy SEAL. And she made a decision. Not a brave decision, not a heroic decision, just the only decision available to a 7-year-old girl who had spent her whole short life being told she was too small, too young, too little to matter. "Okay," she told him, her voice didn't shake this time. "Okay, I've got you." Pete pressed closer, his warm bulk against the man's side, already doing what Pete had always done, holding the line between the living and the cold. In the distance, through the curtain of falling snow, the cabin's chimney still exhaled its thin gray thread. And somewhere beyond the tree line, somewhere Nora couldn't see yet, somewhere Pete hadn't turned to look yet, a truck engine idled, patient, waiting, the sound of a man who had buried something and come back to make sure it stayed buried. Now you know what's waiting under that snow, and you know who found it. The question is whether a 7-year-old girl and her dog can outrun what comes next. Subscribe and hit the bell so you don't miss a single chapter. This story is just getting started. The wood stove had a crack in its left flange that whistled when the wind came from the north. Nora had memorized the sound the way she had memorized most things in the cabin, not deliberately, but by proximity, by repetition, by the particular attention that settles into a child who has learned that the world can go quiet without warning and that you should know the sounds of your life while you still have them. She was 7 years old, and she lived here with her grandmother in a 3-room cabin set back from a county road that the plows sometimes forgot. The nearest town was a 20-minute drive on a good day. On a bad day, which in the Upper Peninsula meant any day between November and March, when the sky decided to mean it, the road became a suggestion, and the cabin became its own small world, complete and sealed, smoke rising from the chimney in a thin line that Nora could see from the tree line and use to find her way home. She had come to live here 2 winters ago, after the accident. She didn't call it the accident because anyone had told her to. She called it that because it was the most accurate word for something that had no other shape she could hold. One night her parents drove south on an icy highway and did not return, and the world that had existed before that night, the house with the yellow kitchen, the sound of her father's boots on the porch steps, her mother's voice carrying through walls like warm water, became a place she could visit only in sleep, and not always even then. What came after was a social worker named Mrs. Aldrich, who smelled like lavender and spoke in the careful, cushioned way adults speak when they are delivering something breakable. Then a car ride north that Nora spent watching the trees get taller and the houses get farther apart, Pete a warm, heavy weight across her lap, his chin on her knee, his amber eyes tracking the window with the focused calm of a dog who understood that his job right now was simply to be present. Pete had been her father's dog first. A working dog, her father always said, though he said it with a particular fondness that gave the word working a softness it didn't usually carry. He had trained Pete himself, in the backyard on weekends, with a patience and precision that Nora had watched from the porch steps, with the serious attention of a child learning something important without knowing yet what it was. When her father didn't come home, Pete transferred his loyalty to Nora with a completeness that left no room for interpretation. He slept at the foot of her bed. He walked between her and strangers. When she cried, which she did, in private, under the covers, so Graham wouldn't hear, he would place his chin on her sternum and hold it there, steady as ballast, until she stopped. Her grandmother was a woman who expressed love through action rather than language. She kept the wood stove fed and the pantry stocked, and Nora's snow boots dried by the door each morning. She taught her things the school curriculum didn't cover: how to read the sky for incoming weather, how to move quietly through the woods so the animals didn't scatter, how to find north without a compass, using the growth pattern of lichen on the north-facing bark of white birch. "The forest will teach you everything," she told Nora once, "as long as you're willing to listen instead of talk." It was the longest sentence Graham had ever said about anything that wasn't practical, and Nora had kept it somewhere interior and important ever since. She was not unhappy here. That was the truest thing she could say about her life in the cabin. Unhappy implied that something was missing, and while things were missing, enormous, irreplaceable things, the life she had was real and warm and hers. She knew the names of the birds that came to the feeder outside the kitchen window. She knew which section of the ice on the creek behind the property was safe to walk, and which was shelf ice that only looked solid. She knew the logging roads and the deer trails, and the 3 places where the pines thinned enough to show a strip of sky. She had no children her age within walking distance. The school bus came on clear days, and on clear days she sat in the second row and read while other kids threw things at each other over the seats, and she didn't mind the separateness so much because she had Pete, and Pete was better company than most people she had met. The red parka had been her mother's last gift. Ordered online, arrived in a cardboard box 3 days before everything changed, her mother holding it up in the kitchen light and saying, "There. Now I'll always be able to find you." Nora had worn it that afternoon, spinning in the kitchen with her arms out while her mother laughed, and that image was one she returned to often. The red coat catching the kitchen light, her mother's laugh filling the yellow room, Pete watching from his bed in the corner with his tail moving slow and content. She wore it every day now. It was 2 sizes too big. She didn't care. This morning she had told Graham she was going to the woodpile. It was a true statement as far as it went. She had gone to the woodpile, filled her sack, and then kept walking because the morning was still, and Pete's nose had found something on the air that made him pull forward with quiet insistence. And she had learned long ago that when Pete moved like that, with that particular locked focus, the right thing to do was follow. She had not expected to find a man buried in the snow. She had not expected his eyes to open and find her face and fill, slowly, with something that looked terrifyingly like relief. She had not expected to hear, beneath the silence of the pines, the low idle of an engine she didn't recognize, parked somewhere just out of sight, running, waiting, patient as winter itself. But here she was, and Pete's ears were already turning toward the sound. Pete heard it first. That was always how it went between them, Pete's ears catching the world a full beat before Nora's could, his body translating the information into posture and stillness before she had even registered that something had changed. One moment he was pressed warm against Gabriel's side, his breath rising in small clouds against the man's frost-covered jacket. The next he was upright, rigid, his broad head swiveled toward the eastern tree line with the locked precision of something that did not make mistakes about what it was sensing. Nora followed his gaze. Through the gauze of falling snow, through the vertical bars of the pine trunks, she could just make out the logging road where it curved east before disappearing behind a ridge. It was a road she knew. She had walked it with Pete in better seasons, had picked wild blueberries from the bushes that grew along its edge in July, had watched Graham navigate it in the old truck on supply runs without giving it a second thought. It was a familiar road, a safe road. The truck parked at its far end was neither. It sat at the edge of visibility, maybe 300 yards out, maybe more, hard to judge through the weather. Dark-colored, heavy-framed, the kind of vehicle that was built for utility rather than appearance. Its engine was running. She could hear it now that she was listening, a low diesel rumble that didn't belong to the morning's quiet, that pressed against the natural silence of the forest like a thumb against a bruise. The headlights were off. It wasn't moving. It was watching. Nora understood this, the way children understand things they have no vocabulary for yet, through the body, through the stomach, through some primitive and reliable instinct that adults spend years learning to talk themselves out of. The truck was not lost. The truck was not passing through. The truck was parked at the edge of the tree line with its engine running and its lights off, and it had been there long enough that the snow had begun to settle on its hood in a thin white layer. Someone had been there when she arrived, had been there the whole time. Gabriel made a sound, not words, just a low, broken exhale that pulled her attention back to him. His eyes were open but unfocused, drifting between the sky and her face, with the slow, underwater quality of someone fighting to stay on the right side of consciousness. The wound above his brow had bled again where the cold had cracked the seal, a thin thread of red tracing the line of his temple. His bound wrists were still beneath the snow, and she had been working at the zip tie with numb fingers and no success. She needed something sharp. She needed warmth. She needed help that she didn't have yet. She pressed her scarf more firmly against his forehead and leaned close. "I see the truck," she told him quietly, because something told her he already knew, that the truck was not new information to him, that the truck was, in fact, the whole reason he was in the ground. His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, confirmation enough. She looked back toward the road. The truck hadn't moved, but she could see something now that she hadn't been able to make out before, a shape behind the windshield, barely visible through the falling snow and the distance, just the suggestion of a figure in the driver's seat, sitting, still, the posture of a person who was comfortable with waiting because they had waited before and always gotten what they came back for. She knew who it was, not the name, she didn't have a name yet, but she knew the type. Graham had described it once, on an evening when Nora had come home upset about something a school official had done that felt wrong and been told was fine because that was just how things worked. There are people, Graham had said, scraping carrots over the sink without looking up, who decide which truths get to come up and which ones stay buried. They're not always the loudest ones. Sometimes they're just the ones who got there first, with a shovel. Nora had been 6 then, and had filed it away without fully understanding it. She understood it now. The man behind that windshield had gotten there first with a shovel. He had used it on Gabriel, on a Navy SEAL, on a person whose name she didn't know yet, and whose crime she couldn't guess, and he had driven away and left the job to the cold and the snow and the quiet of the forest that didn't take sides. And now he was back, not with the shovel this time, just with his engine and his patience, to confirm that the ground had kept his secret. It hadn't. Pete let out a sound so low it was less a growl than a vibration, felt more than heard, his eyes fixed on the distant truck with an unblinking steadiness that Nora recognized as the far end of his patience. She put her hand on his back. "Not yet," she murmured. Gabriel's eyes had found her face again. Clearer now, more present. He was working to say something, his cracked lips forming shapes that the cold kept stealing before they became sound. She leaned in until she was close enough to feel the faint warmth of his breath. "Don't let him see you," he managed, barely a whisper, rough as gravel, but clear. Nora looked once more at the dark truck at the edge of the tree line, at the figure behind the glass, who believed so completely in his own power that he had come back in daylight, without hurry, certain that no one would be standing over his buried secret in a red parka and snow boots. She pulled the hood of her coat up over her red hat. Then she looked down at Gabriel and made him a promise she intended to keep. "He's not going to," she said, "but we need to move. Ronald thinks he can bury the truth forever and let the cold finish what he started. Are you on the side of the people who hide the truth, or will you hit like right now to stand with Nora? Don't let the gatekeepers win." Miss Jean's clinic smelled like antiseptic and pine resin, and something older underneath both, the particular smell of a space that had absorbed decades of fear and pain, and the specific relief that follows when pain is addressed by competent hands. The main room held 2 examination tables, a wall of steel cabinets, a utility sink, and a wood stove in the corner that was doing serious work against the cold that pressed in from every wall. Animal anatomy charts shared space on the walls with hand-drawn maps of the surrounding forest. A shelf of labeled glass jars ran the length of one wall, contents rendered amber and mysterious by the low light. Miss Jean directed Nora and Pete to the far corner, while she assessed Gabriel with the brisk, unsentimental efficiency of someone who had triaged emergencies in conditions that made this room look luxurious. She cut away the upper portion of his jacket with shears from her front pocket, checked his airway, pressed 2 fingers to his neck and counted. Her face gave nothing away, which Nora decided to interpret as a good sign. People's faces went strange when the news was irretrievable. Miss Jean's face was simply focused. "Severe hypothermia," she said, to no one in particular or perhaps to herself. "Dehydration, that laceration needs closing." She was already pulling supplies from the steel cabinets, moving with the economy of motion of someone who had arranged her workspace to match her emergencies. How long was he under? I don't know, Nora said. Pete found him. The snow on top was packed, not fresh. Miss Jean glanced at her over one shoulder with the grey, evaluating eye. You pulled him here on that sled. It was the only thing I had. A pause, something shifted almost imperceptibly in Miss Jean's expression, not softness, exactly, but a slight recalibration. How far? Half a mile, maybe, through the East Trail. Miss Jean turned back to her cabinets. You're going to need dry gloves, she said, second drawer on the left. It was not praise, but from Miss Jean, Nora was beginning to understand. Practicality was the highest form of acknowledgement available. The wood stove was fed, and the room was warming, and Gabriel was on the examination table under 2 wool blankets when Miss Jean straightened and said, without turning around, I can stabilize. I can't do what he actually needs. Nora looked at her. What does he actually need? Proper IV access, warmed fluids, a surgical hand on that head wound. She paused. Bailey. The name landed in the room differently than the other words. Smaller, more careful, like a word that had weight and history attached to it. Who's Bailey? Nora asked. Miss Jean was quiet for a moment, reorganizing instruments on a steel tray with the concentrated attention of someone deciding how much to say. She lives in the old ranger station, 3/4 of a mile north, up the fire road. Another pause. Former military medic. She knows what to do with this kind of injury. She's done it before, in conditions considerably worse than this. Then why isn't she here? Because she doesn't leave the station much. Miss Jean set down her instrument tray and looked at Nora directly. She had her own trouble some years back, the kind that makes a person want a great deal of distance between themselves and the rest of the world. She's been out here long enough that the distance feels necessary to her, a beat. She won't come for me, she might come for this. She was looking at Nora when she said this, not at Gabriel. Nora understood. She looked at Pete. Pete was already on his feet. The fire road was barely a road anymore, 2 faint parallel depressions in the snow, lined by pines grown close enough that their lower branches interlocked overhead, forming a tunnel of dark green and white that the weak afternoon light barely penetrated. Nora moved fast, Pete at her shoulder, her breath coming in visible bursts that dissolved into the cold behind her. The rope burns on her ribs had stiffened into a dull, constant ache that she breathed around rather than stopping for. The ranger station appeared between the trees without much warning, a low, single-story structure built from the same dark timber as the forest around it, with a covered porch and a metal roof bearing 2 feet of accumulated snow. A stack of split wood against the east wall, neat and high, someone who planned ahead, who took winter seriously. A single light in the left window. No vehicle visible, but the porch steps had been recently cleared, the wood still pale where the shovel had scraped it clean. Nora knocked. The silence on the other side was different from Miss Jean's silence. Miss Jean's had been the silence of deliberation. This was the silence of someone who had learned to be very still when unexpected sounds arrived. I'm 7 years old, Nora said to the door, because it seemed like the most relevant information she could offer. I have a German shepherd. I'm not here to cause trouble. Miss Jean sent me. There's a man who was buried in the snow and he's going to die if someone doesn't help him, and Miss Jean says you know how. A longer silence. Then the sound of a single deadbolt. The woman who opened the door was younger than Nora had expected, maybe mid-30s, with the lean, self-contained build of someone who moved and worked and did not spend much time being still. Dark circles under steady hazel eyes. Brown hair pulled back without ceremony. She was wearing a thermal shirt with the sleeves pushed to the elbows despite the cold, and on her left forearm, partially visible, was the edge of a tattoo Nora couldn't read. She looked at Nora with an expression that was measuring without being unkind. Her eyes dropped to Pete. Pete sat and held her gaze with the calm authority he reserved for people he was still deciding about. Bailey, the woman said, not introducing herself so much as confirming she was still who she'd been. Nora said. Bailey looked past her down the fire road, then back. "Navy?" she asked quietly, as if she already knew. "There's a patch on his jacket." Something moved through Bailey's face, complicated and quick, there and gone. She turned back inside without another word, and Nora heard the rapid, purposeful sounds of a person gathering what they needed: a bag, a case, the zip of a medical kit. She was back at the door in under 90 seconds, a dark canvas pack over one shoulder and a hard-sided case in her right hand. She had added a coat, but not bothered to button it. "Show me," she said. Bailey worked the way Nora imagined surgeons worked, with a quiet, absolute concentration that made the room smaller and more serious, that compressed everything unnecessary to the edges so that only the work remained. She spoke in short directives that Miss Jean answered without question, their movements developing a rhythm within minutes, a practiced call and response built on mutual competence and mutual respect for the urgency of the moment. IV line, warmed saline. The head wound cleaned and closed with a steadiness of hand that Pete watched from his position beside the door, head tilted, tracking Bailey with the focused attention he gave to things that were new but not dangerous. Gabriel was more conscious now, the warmth of the room and the blankets doing their slow, necessary work. His eyes tracked Bailey's movements with the recognition of a soldier processing information even through considerable pain. At one point, when Bailey's hands were at his wrist checking his pulse, he said something too low for Nora to catch. Bailey's jaw tightened. She didn't respond, but her hands moved a fraction faster. Nora stood at the window, not because she'd been told to, but because someone needed to, and she was the one available. Pete joined her, his shoulder against her hip, both of them watching the fire road through the frost-edged glass. The snow was still falling. The pines were still and grey. For now, the road was empty. For now. Chapter 5. The phone line at Miss Jean's clinic ran on a single copper wire that had been strung through the pines decades ago by a telephone company that no longer existed under that name. It was not a sophisticated system. It did not need to be. In the Upper Peninsula, the old infrastructure often outlasted the organizations that built it, maintained by habit and necessity rather than investment. Miss Jean paid her bill and the line worked, and that was the arrangement. It stopped working at 2:30 in the afternoon. Nora noticed first because she was the one closest to the wall phone when the change happened, not a sound, exactly, but the absence of one. The faint, continuous electrical hum that she hadn't consciously registered until it was gone. She lifted the receiver and heard nothing, not static, not interference, just the particular blankness of a line that had been interrupted at its source. She set the receiver back without saying anything and went to the window. The fire road was still empty. The snow was still falling. The pines stood in their patient rows, holding their weight of white, giving nothing away. But the absence of that hum sat in her chest like a stone because she understood what it meant even before her mind had assembled the full sequence of logic. Phone's lines didn't fail in calm weather. They failed in ice storms, when branches came down on the wire, when the cold contracted the metal past its tolerance. None of those conditions existed right now. The air was cold but still, the snow was light and dry, and the wire that served this clinic ran through a section of forest she knew, along a route she had walked, and there was nothing on that route that would take a line down on a quiet afternoon in February. Nothing natural, anyway. She turned from the window. Miss Jean. Miss Jean was at the steel cabinet, restocking supplies with the systematic attention she gave to everything. She looked up at Nora's tone, not the word, but the quality of it, the particular flatness that meant the news was practical rather than emotional. "Phone's dead," Nora said. Miss Jean set down the box of gauze she was holding, slowly, the way people set things down when they need their hands free to think. She and Bailey exchanged a look across the room, brief and direct, the kind of look that carried a long conversation in a very short time. Bailey was seated on a stool beside Gabriel's examination table, her medical kit repacked and resting against her boot, her hazel eyes moving between the window and Miss Jean's face. She had not relaxed since they arrived. Nora had noticed this, that Bailey carried her alertness, the way other people carried their posture, as a default setting rather than a response to specific stimulus. It was the alertness of someone who had learned, in circumstances she didn't discuss, that the moment you stopped paying attention was the moment things went wrong. "He found us," Bailey said, "not a question." "He found the clinic," Miss Jean said, which was a distinction that mattered. "He may not know exactly what's inside it yet." "He cut the line," Nora said, "which means he knows we can't call out, which means he's not worried about us calling for help." She paused, working through the logic the way Graham had taught her to work through problems in the forest, sequentially, without panic, because panic consumed the energy you needed for solutions, which means he thinks he has time. Both women looked at her, Bailey with something that might have been the beginning of reassessment. Miss Jean with the expression she'd worn since the door, the grey, evaluating steadiness of a person recalibrating what she thought she was dealing with. Gabriel's voice came from the examination table, low and rough, but more coherent than it had been an hour ago. "He's done this before," a pause for breath. "Cut the line first, then the road." Another pause. "He doesn't rush. That's what makes him dangerous. He's not angry, he's just thorough." The word thorough landed in the room like something cold. Nora thought about the truck she'd seen at the tree line, the figure behind the windshield, sitting without hurry in the falling snow. The patience of a person who had buried a man and driven away and come back later to check, unhurried, certain. She thought about what that kind of certainty required, not just power, but a long and uninterrupted history of power going unquestioned. A history of people stepping aside, of phones going unanswered, of inconvenient truths finding their way back into the ground. Ronald, she had learned his name from Gabriel in the hour since they'd arrived, spoken in a brief, strained account that Bailey had tried to pause and Miss Jean had let continue because the information mattered. Ronald was not a man who expected resistance. He was a man who had arranged the world carefully enough that resistance rarely materialized. He had the county behind him, or enough of it. He had the phone lines and the roads and the knowledge of who lived out here and how isolated they were. What he did not have, what he could not have accounted for, because it was not the kind of variable that appeared in his calculations, was a 7-year-old girl who had grown up learning that the world could take everything from you without warning, and that the only response to that fact was to hold tighter to what remained. Nora looked at Pete. He was at the door, nose working the gap at its base, reading the cold air outside with his whole extraordinary attention. She looked at Bailey. "Does your satellite communicator work without cell towers?" Bailey blinked, then reached slowly into the side pocket of her canvas pack and produced a small, flat device, matte black, ruggedized, a single orange button on its face. "Yes," she said. "Then he didn't cut the right line," Nora said. A silence settled over the room. Outside, the snow continued its patient work, covering tracks, erasing evidence, making the world look clean and empty and safe. Ronald was somewhere in those trees, or on that road, moving with the unhurried confidence of a man who believed that isolation was the same as victory, that if you cut a person off from the world completely, the world would simply stop looking for them. He had spent years making people disappear that way, not always with a shovel, sometimes just with silence, with a phone line, with the slow, suffocating pressure of being made to feel that no one was coming, that no one would believe you, that the smart thing, the safe thing, was to stop fighting and accept the shape of the world as he had arranged it. Pete lifted his head from the door gap and looked at Nora with his amber eyes, waiting. She put her hand on his broad back and felt the solid reality of him, warm and present and completely, unconditionally on her side. "Would you have the courage to help a stranger when a man like Ronald has cut you off from the world and is moving through the trees toward your door? If you believe that bullying should never win, that no one should have the power to make people disappear, then subscribe right now and join this community of protectors, because Nora didn't quit, and neither should we." The man came from the wrong direction. That was the thing Nora hadn't accounted for, that Ronald, careful and thorough as he was, would have placed someone west of the clinic rather than east, a fourth man positioned not to pursue, but to wait, to cover the ground that the others flushed toward him. It was patient thinking. the thinking of someone who had done this before and learned from the times it had gone wrong. She heard him before she saw him, a soft, deliberate compression of snow to her left, moving parallel to the drainage cut, close enough that the sound had texture and weight, not the crashing redirection of the two men she'd drawn into the pines. This was different, controlled, careful, the footfall of someone who was not chasing but intercepting, someone who had been standing still in the dark for a long time and had now identified exactly where she was. Pete heard it before she consciously processed it. She felt the change in him, the subtle shift from stillness into a different kind of stillness, the coiling quality, every muscle moving from rest into readiness in a single seamless transition. His head dropped slightly. His weight moved forward onto his front legs. His eyes locked left with an absolute, unblinking focus. Nora pressed harder against the pine trunk and did not breathe. The shape emerged from between two trees 20 feet away, a large man in a dark coat, moving with the low, careful crouch of someone who thought he was being quiet. He hadn't seen her yet. He was scanning the drainage cut ahead, looking for movement, his attention directed forward rather than at the tree immediately to his right, where a 7-year-old girl in a red parka was standing completely still and praying that the dark and the trunk were enough. They weren't. His scan came back, slowed, stopped. He had seen the parka. Even in the dark, even at 20 feet, red was red. He took one step toward her. Pete moved. There was no bark this time, no warning sound, no announcement of any kind. Pete simply went from stillness to motion in the way that large, trained dogs go, not gradually, but instantaneously. The space between rest and full speed collapsed to nothing, 80 pounds of German Shepherd, covering 20 feet of frozen ground before the man had completed his second step. The impact was total. Pete hit him at the chest, an upper arm with the concentrated force of everything he was. The weight, the speed, the absolute commitment of a dog who had decided that this person represented a threat to the specific small human he had appointed himself responsible for. The man went down hard, his back hitting the snow with a sound that compressed the air from his lungs in a single sharp exhalation. He tried to rise immediately, the reflex of someone trained to get back up, and Pete's jaws closed on his forearm with a precision that was not frantic but deliberate, the controlled bite of a working dog who knew the difference between stopping someone and hurting them unnecessarily, and who was doing the former with complete authority. The man stopped moving. Pete held. He didn't growl, he didn't shake. He simply maintained the grip with the calm certainty of an animal that had made a decision and saw no reason to revisit it, his amber eyes on the man's face, reading him the way he read everything, completely, without interruption. Nora stepped away from the pine trunk. Her legs were shaking. She registered this as information rather than impediment, the way Graham had taught her to register pain, note it, file it, deal with it when the situation permits. She crossed the frozen ground to where Pete held the man down and looked at the situation with the clear, practical assessment she had been developing since the age of 5, when the world had demonstrated its willingness to change shape without notice, and she had started paying closer attention. The man was large and he was down, and he was not going anywhere that Pete didn't permit. He was looking up at her with an expression she recognized, not the cold patience of Ronald's particular brand of cruelty, but something more human and more frightened. The expression of a person who had agreed to something in daylight that had become considerably larger and more real in the dark. Don't, she told him, one word. The same word Graham used when Pete was about to make a poor decision near the wood stove, flat and final and not requiring elaboration. The man looked at the dog, then back at Nora. He didn't move. From the direction of the clinic, she heard voices, multiple, overlapping, and then the unmistakable quality of an exchange between people who were not on the same side, the particular acoustic texture of a confrontation that had a new variable in it. Miss Jean's transmission had brought something to that road, not fast enough to prevent this moment, but present enough to change the shape of what came next. Then she heard Ronald. She had never heard his voice before, but she knew it immediately, the voice of a man accustomed to being heard, carrying across the dark and the snow with the projected confidence of someone who had not yet updated his understanding of the situation. He was at the clinic. He was at the door. He was saying something in the tone of a man who believed he was still the one determining how the night ended. And then a second voice, flat and carrying the particular authority of a frequency and a badge number. A state trooper responding to Miss Jean's transmission, standing between Ronald Prout and the clinic door with the immovable quality of a system that Ronald had not yet managed to compromise at this level, in this county, on this specific night. Nora heard Ronald's voice change. Just slightly, just enough. The way a structure sounds different when the thing holding it up has been removed, still standing, for a moment, but no longer for the reasons it believed. She kept her eyes on the man Pete was holding and listened to that change in Ronald's voice and felt something shift in her chest. Not triumph, exactly. Not yet. Something quieter and more foundational. The feeling of a weight that had been pressing since morning lifting 1 degree, just one, enough to let her breathe differently. Pete's ears moved toward the clinic, without his eyes, leaving the man beneath him. "Good boy," Nora said quietly. His tail moved once. She reached into her coat pocket and found the small whistle Bailey had given her at the back door. She brought it to her lips and blew 3 short blasts, the signal, the all clear, the sound that meant I'm here and I'm whole and you can stop holding your breath now. The forest carried it through the pines toward the clinic light. In the dark, the man on the ground looked up at the 7-year-old standing over him with a German shepherd and a whistle and a red parka that had been visible from 20 feet in the dark, and something in his face moved through several expressions before settling on the one that fit. The particular humbling bewilderment of a person who has been outsmarted by someone they did not take seriously. Nora looked down at him without malice and without satisfaction, just with the clear, steady eyes of a child who had decided, somewhere in the middle of the worst day of her short life, that small did not mean powerless and that the people who counted on that assumption were counting on the wrong thing. The men who buried Gabriel alive believed that power meant you could make people disappear and no one would come looking. Pete just proved them wrong. Comment, everyone deserves respect right now if you believe Ronald needs to face justice for every single thing he did. And stay with us, because this story isn't finished yet. The state police came in 2 vehicles, then 3. Nora heard them before she saw them, the crunch of tires on the packed snow of the fire road, the sweep of headlights through the pines making the tree trunks strobe white and dark in alternating pulses. Real lights this time. Lights that announced themselves, that made no attempt at concealment, that carried in their brightness the particular authority of a system arriving to correct something that had gone wrong inside itself. She walked out of the pines with Pete at her side and the man from the woods walking ahead of her, his forearm held carefully against his chest, his posture carrying the collapsed quality of someone who had made several decisions over the course of the evening that he was now comprehensively regretting. She had not asked him to walk ahead. He had simply started moving in the direction of the lights when Pete had released him and stood, and she had followed, because it was the direction she needed to go anyway. The scene at the clinic had rearranged itself completely in the time she had been in the woods. 2 troopers stood near the clinic door, their body language the language of people who have taken control of a situation and are in the process of determining its full dimensions. Ronald Prout stood to the left of the door, and he looked, for the first time, she imagined, in a very long time, like a man whose size had been revised downward. He was heavyset, mid-50s, with the broad shoulders and settled authority of someone who had occupied positions of local power long enough that the power had become indistinguishable from his personality. But authority is a thing that lives in other people's responses to you, and the 2 troopers were not responding to him in the way he was accustomed to. They were listening to him the way you listen to someone whose account you are recording rather than accepting. His remaining man stood nearby, hands visible, saying nothing. Ronald saw Nora emerge from the tree line. She watched his face move through several calculations in rapid succession, who she was, what she represented, what her presence here implied about the sequence of the evening. She saw the moment he arrived at the conclusion that the evening had not gone as arranged. It was not a dramatic moment. It was quiet, internal, visible only in the slight reconfiguration of his jaw and the quality of his eyes shifting from the active to the retrospective. She walked past him without stopping and went inside to find Gabriel. He was sitting up on the examination table, Bailey beside him. Miss Jean standing at the window, watching the activity outside with her arms folded and her grey eyes holding the expression of a woman who had been waiting a long time for a particular kind of accounting and was allowing herself, cautiously, to believe it had begun. Gabriel saw Nora in the doorway, and something in his face opened up in a way it hadn't before, a warmth that the cold and the pain and the long, terrible hours hadn't entirely extinguished, surfacing now that the immediate threat had contracted to something manageable. Pete went to him directly, as he had in the snow that morning, and placed his chin on the edge of the examination table. Gabriel put his hand on the dog's head with the careful reverence of someone handling something that has saved their life and knows it. "All clear," Nora said. "I heard the whistle," Gabriel said. She crossed the room and stood beside the table and looked at him, at the closed laceration above his brow. The warmth returned to his face, the evidence of what had been done to him still visible but no longer progressing. A man who had been put in the ground and had refused, by two knuckles tapping against frozen earth, to stay there. "The troopers are outside," she said. "Ronald is with them." Gabriel nodded slowly. He was already reaching for Bailey's canvas pack, which she surrendered without comment, and removing from its inner pocket a folded piece of paper and a pen. He uncapped the pen and began to write. His hand was not entirely steady. The cold had taken something from his fine motor control that would take time to fully return, but the letters were legible and deliberate, each name placed on the page with the care of someone who understood that these 11 words represented the entire reason for everything that had happened in the last several days. He wrote for 2 minutes, then he folded the paper, held it for a moment, and held it out to Nora. She looked at it without taking it immediately. "Why me?" she asked. "Because you're the only person in this room," he said, "who Ronald never planned for." A pause. "Nobody built a contingency around a 7-year-old. That makes you the safest pair of hands here." She took the paper and put it inside her parka against her chest, where the warmth of her body would keep it. The next hour moved in the procedural rhythm of official things, correcting unofficial ones. Statements taken, names recorded, the hard-sided case of Bailey's medical kit opened for inspection and its contents acknowledged. A senior trooper arrived from the county seat, then a federal agent who had driven up from the south on roads that were worsening by the hour and who spoke to Gabriel in low, rapid sentences near the window while Bailey watched and Miss Jean made coffee that no one had asked for and everyone accepted. Ronald Prout was placed in handcuffs at 20 minutes past 7. Nora watched from the clinic doorway, Pete sitting against her left leg, his shoulder warm against her knee. Ronald was walked to the rear of a state police vehicle with the unhurried efficiency of a process that had finally, after considerable obstruction, been allowed to proceed. He did not look at Nora as he passed. She thought he might not be able to. There was a particular difficulty, she imagined, in looking at the thing that had undone you when that thing was a child in a red parka and a dog with amber eyes. The vehicle door closed. She watched the lights until they moved down the fire road and were absorbed by the dark and the snow and the distance. They let Gabriel rest for another hour before the federal agent indicated, with the careful apology of someone who understood timing and couldn't fully honor it, that transportation was waiting. Bailey had done everything that could be done here. The rest required a hospital, a debrief, a chain of custody for the paper folded inside Nora's parka that she surrendered to the agent with the solemn attention of someone completing a task they had been trusted with. Gabriel stood at the clinic door, Bailey at his left, moving under his own power though not without cost. He stopped in front of Nora. He was very tall from this angle, or she was very small, probably both. He looked down at her with an expression that contained more than she had words for yet, the expression of a person trying to compress something enormous into something that could be said out loud in a doorway. I've been in situations, he said carefully, where the difference between living and not came down to one decision by one person at the right moment. He paused. I've never had that person be 7 years old. Nora looked at him steadily. Pete did most of it. Pete, Gabriel said, looking at the dog, is extraordinary. He looked back at her. So is his person. Pete's tail moved with the slow, dignified sweep he reserved for moments he apparently deemed worthy of acknowledgement. Gabriel crouched with some effort to Nora's eye level. Up close, she could see the full map of what the last several days had cost him, but beneath it, beneath the laceration and the frost damage and the exhaustion, something else. The face of a person who had been returned to the world and was not taking the return lightly. I'm going to remember you, he said. For the rest of my life, every day I'm going to remember you. A pause. Is that all right, little commander? Nora considered this with the seriousness it deserved. Yes, she said, that's all right. He stood, nodded once to Miss Jean, once to Bailey, and walked out into the snow toward the waiting vehicle, the federal agent at his side, the night receiving him back into its cold and its dark, and its enormous, indifferent quiet. Bailey stood beside Nora in the doorway, and they watched together until the lights were gone. You should call your grandmother, Bailey said. I know, Nora said. I've been working up to that. Bailey made a sound that was almost, not quite, a laugh, the first one Nora had heard from her. Pete pressed against Nora's leg and looked out at the dark fire road and the falling snow and the pines standing their patient watch, the same as they had stood all day, through the burial and the finding and the running and the holding, through all of it, indifferent and enormous and unchanged. Nora put her hand on his back and stood in the light of the clinic doorway in her red parka, her grandmother's chimney smoke somewhere to the south, the cold clean on her face. She had gone out for firewood this morning. She had come back with something else entirely. And somewhere to the north, moving through the dark toward a hospital and a debrief, and 11 names on a folded piece of paper that would take a very long time to stop mattering. A Navy SEAL was keeping a promise he had made in a doorway to a 7-year-old girl who had decided, on a quiet morning in the snow, that small did not mean powerless. It never had.